Right.
Thank you so much for joining. I want to start with Gen Z because you're doing some interesting things with that. Talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing, what tools you've created, what you're trying to do to make things easier for CMOs and others to navigate this space.
Right, right. So, Jeff, I think over the last 5 years, marketers have been just grappling with the challenge of marketing to the Gen Z cohort, right? You and I
Mhm.
keep hearing Gen Z in and out, and it's part of a large conversations. But we always felt that it was just part of the conversation, right? We felt that there was something still lacking, right? You're talking about, like, just for the context, right? They're the ones who were born between 97 and 2012, right? So today the youngest is like 12 and the oldest is 27. All right. So while in our head, whenever we think Gen Z very young, but the oldest are already 27, right? Range might shift from geography to geography, but there's still broadly this is the kind of a time, in terms of the year frame
Wait,
that is out there.
2024, so 28 now.
Yeah, 28
Yeah.
essentially are the oldest Gen Zs, right?
Life happens fast. I'm technically an elderly millennial, and so but it is true. Like there is a truism or a commonality generally on these things, but you ask 10 people and they might give you a slightly different answer. But I think what you're getting at is marketing to a 12-year-old and marketing to a 28-year-old, very different things.
Very, very different, right? In fact, once considered to be individuals, let's say, of little influence, you've got Gen Z emerge as a significant force in the consumer market, right? Our conversations across FMCG, across entertainment, across automotive for that matter, is now trying to go more of understanding this Gen Z cohort, what would happen. In fact, if you look at it, their estimated buying power globally is $360 billion. All right. So you're talking about a $360 billion cohort, right? So today their influence is everything from stocks, cryptos, cultures to building $1 million businesses. It's everywhere, right? And
Yeah.
beyond snowflake cliches that Gen Zs are kind of spoken about, they're set to reshape politics, economies, workplaces, healthcare, brand marketing, positioning, uh, overall the architects of a significant generational shifts. Now, when you look at that kind of a cohort of audience and you look back at the fundamentals of marketing, how they were shaped essentially when we were growing up and understanding Kotlers of the world and things like that, that is a complete change now. So when that change happens, uh, we realized it almost a year and a half to two back when we were part of all the board meetings or discussions with CXOs and CMOs that we don't have enough information. We're all kind of
Hmm.
trying to go by intuition out here, and that clearly will not kind of lead to the way we want it across to go, right? So what we did is we came up with this whole specialized research arm called Capital Z, which is completely aimed to understand or do a deep level research around Gen Zs, right? And kind of segregate understanding the data, audience cohorts, their consumption patterns, what do they think about the things that we like or we do, what is their take on things, what is their take on things like what is a cool brand, what is a purpose, should a brand have a purpose, because that's a large part of conversations, right? What is does are there times when the brand only does the lip service, is that enough essentially, or the brand really needs to get into the purpose? These are the kind of conversations and dissections that we've done over a period of time in Capital Z, and that's something that we're taking to the global brands, and they're kind of really into the whole thing, where they've asked us to go far more into detail and create campaigns and processes out of which helps the brand to sustain in the future and be relevant to this audience. So I think that's our current involvement around Gen Z.
Also, I think my
Yeah.
takeaway here is um, Gen Z as a audience segment, right? Maybe half a decade back, right? They weren't big enough, right? Maybe 10 years back,
Yeah.
they weren't existing in the consumer pool, right? Most of them, right? Because their buyings would never be direct, right? Average, if we were to consider, right? Statistically, there are estimates which say by 2030, Gen Zs would account for 75% of mass consumption,
Yeah.
right? Now, these Gen Zs buy differently, consume content in complete different manners than what a Gen X or a Gen Y would consume, behaves differently, likes or dislikes brands, on reasons which maybe a Gen X and a Gen Y can't even fathom, right? So, as a marketer, right, or CXOs should start taking a note of, or should start learning from them, because they are going to rule consumption in future, right?
Oh,
And
that's for sure. One of the interesting premises I always think about is there there are definitely nuances to every generation, right? That they process things differently, they consume things differently.
Correct.
There are different ways to market to them, but there are also universal truths with that. It is dependent on life cycle, right? Are you a single person? Do you have kids? What are your
Correct.
responsibilities like? So, I it's interesting because some of the discussions of Gen Z mirror the discussions of millennials maybe 10, 15 years ago, but there are, and you are alluding to them, there are distinct differences with Gen Z. I kind of want to unpack that even more.
I think just think about it is like we always discuss this internally, right? What makes Gen Z so challenging to the market is not just because they're a new generation, which is an obvious shift, right? It's like a new market, new product market fit kind of a conversation always, right? Uh, However, think about it. They're often coined as the most generation, right? A generation that is most radically and ethnically diverse. They're the most educated generation. They're the most digitally savvy generation. They're the most global and has seen the most political crisis as a generation, right?
Facts.
They're seeing the most climate change as a generation, right?
Definitely.
They're seeing the most mental health challenges as a generation,
Whew.
right?
Yeah.
And so much destabilization. Now imagine a whole generation that is being brought up in this kind of a geopolitical, social, cultural environment, right? While there would be similarities that we could say that, hey, every generation, when it comes, a new cycle comes, there would be certain similarities. Basic human truths don't change. But when the social impact changes so much, that generation is bound to be very different to what you and I are today, right? I think that really brings up the challenge. That really brings up that there is a need to look at them in a completely new fashion, right? We always say that they are creators of a differential value, right? So, and that's something that has to be kept in mind.
Well, yeah, and again, this is geographically different, right? A Gen Z in South Korea versus a Gen Z in the United States. A Gen Z in South Korea might be working for one company for 30 years. A Gen Z in the United States is probably working for 20 different places. So there's different things in mobility. There are nuances when you're talking about different global markets. What I'm fascinated by with Gen Z, and this is true, right? The younger you are, the more you're probably concerned with climate change because it may probably affect you. The younger you are, the more you might be concerned with social safety net programs that may not exist. So there are definitely things that, if you have a longer lifespan in front of you, you know,
Correct.
I I I understand why an 85-year-old is like, I'm not that worried about climate change. I'm like,
True.
okay, I get it. I get it. I mean, I still would be, but I understand. I'm like, okay, like, yes, Iceland has a bunch of volcanoes going on right now. That probably won't impact you. But what one of the things that I'm thinking about the most when you're marketing to Gen Z is, are they are they more social impact focused than millennials, and how?
Yes. Correct. I think you look at it in this way.
social impact focus, right?
Yes.
So I think yes. See, understand, Gen Z as a generation has seen social networks and the whole internet age since, quite literally, since the time they started understanding reading. For in all
Mm,
probability, their first reading assignment would be a digital device, right?
yes.
So these guys have been born and brought up in a digital first ecosystem, right? Which maybe our generation wasn't, right? And hence they're a lot more connected to their peers and other, say layer 2 of their social circle. It could be social circle of people they may not have met but only have connected online, right? Now, since these guys are a lot more connected, these guys are also a lot more vocal, right? And now, given that these two things are there, right, they are very vocal and they are very connected with a lot of audience on the digital ecosystem, and hence, you know, subconsciously they have this feeling of being more. I don't know how to put it in words, but subconsciously, I think they have this feeling of being more socially correct. They have this feeling to care. They have this ambition and they have this aspiration to to care a lot more about these things than the entire Gen Y and Gen X ecosystem, because they are a lot more connected to a larger audience group.
Yeah, the other thing too is, and you touched on this briefly back there, is anxiety, right? The more
Correct. Yes.
connected you are, the more access you have to things. It's proving out. Like Jordan Howlett, who's like a 26-year-old YouTuber right now, had something that went very viral where he was basically pointing out that people think he's older than The Rock, and he was like, he's like, come closer. I am not. I am not older than The Rock. I'm 26 years old. I've just got all these different things that I'm thinking about and I'm processing.
Correct.
And so he looks older. And then, and of course, the selfish part of me listens to that whole thing. And he's like, and millennials are actually aging better. I was like, tell me more. I'm interested in this. I like this. But when you know that a generation is absolutely overloaded with content
Yes.
and they're anxious, how do you market effectively to that?
So I think it's an absolutely fair understanding, right? That there's an overload of information, and that is not a good thing, right? In fact, there's a particular term. So across the world, fighter pilots, Air Force pilots, right, are facing a kind of a very new age crisis where there's an overload of information when they're flying the planes.
Yeah.
At some point of time, that information was good. I had a digital compass. I know where my plane was going. I could put it on autopilot, blah, 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 blah. But those were like 10 pieces of information that I really need. Now, suddenly I have 100 pieces of information right in front of me. And now the brain has all the options of, choosing. And that's not a good thing when you have to make instant decisions. And that's something that, it's something that being worked upon. And similarly, that's the lives of now all the Gen Zs we're talking about, everyone. Maybe when you and I grew up, we were more concerned about what was happening in our neighborhood, in our cities, maybe in our states, and maybe in our countries. It's the global problems which is now everyone's problem, and that is the reality. So when you look
Absolutely.
at it, yeah, I mean, when you look at it in this case, I believe what sets them apart at this point of time is they are socially conscious, they're independent, they have a very connected nature. That's something which is very important for brands to understand today, right? There is a far less brand loyalty because the number of options that I have on the table are so
Yep.
much higher,
That's
right?
exactly what my next question was going to be. Perfect.
There is no brand loyalty, or quite less, right? And a brand also has to strive very continuously.
Yeah.
A brand also has to bring a purpose to the table, right? Because they are buying with a purpose. They kind of value authenticity and transparency. The rise of indie brands or the rise of certain trends, example K-beauty across the globe, kind of goes across and shows something very, very different. These are not the trends that were observed in the past, right? Brands must go beyond seeing them as mere consumers and understand, what truly resonates with them. Internally at WRM, at White Rivers Media, we kind of shifted our whole thought process from consumers to prosumers. So you are looking at a set of consumers that is asking more of you. They're asking you to tailor make your products for them. They are asking you to create micro communities or digital campfires where they can get along with the people of similar mindset, have a conversation on a similar fashion, right? Uh, if you look at it, born into the digital age, they have unparalleled access to information. They have turned it into a savvy comparison shoppers at the end of the day, right? They are far better than anyone else to quickly compare that what are my options and why should I go with it, right? Because of their frugality and cynicism. because that's what the internet culture is all around. There is a whole new trend about frugality on TikTok globally at this point of time, which is talking to
Absolutely.
people that why do you need to spend this kind of a money? You can save the money and you can buy this instead of this, right? So when you look at all of that, they are very, they've become pro at spotting marketing gimmicks. They've become very good at spotting false claims instantly, right? So that fakery filter that the brands could apply, because it was advertising. You could be funny, you could be entertaining, and you could still get away with some of the things that you might not be
Mhm.
standing behind 100% of the times. I think that has come into the question. So when you ask that, what do brands need to do? I think brand needs to be very well aware that this consumer has shifted from being a consumer to prosumer. This consumers have demand that I really need to answer. And when I create a community for them and I'm actively involved in that community and I'm talking to them on a day-to-day basis, right? I think the brands are being rewarded for it. In fact, if
Yeah.
any of the global brands we see now, right, they really have to stand very tall either on entertainment or very tall on having a purpose. Unless you're not going in one of these directions, you will not be consumed socially or digitally. And when that consumption is not there, then the brand buying is going to take a hit. So I think also linking what is being consumed online, liked and shared, most importantly, is something that the brands need to now put into focus.
So we started with a plane analogy, and I want to try and land the plane on this. I think, and this probably is it makes sense, and there's a parallel. When you're talking about the life cycle of a marketing campaign, I think that is condensed so much because, again, if you're inundated with information, if you are constantly being given other options, if you have more things available than ever, what I kind of view as the opportunity is, yes, you're probably not going to get somebody to be blindly brand loyal for 15 years like you would have with Gen X based off a couple touch points. What you can do though is you can have these, and you see these isolated bursts of massive loyalty, right? Maybe it's a month, maybe it's 2 months, maybe it's 6 months, but this, when something catches fire, it absolutely catches fire, and it allows you to maximize. The problem is, or I guess the double edge to this is, you can absolutely have a situation where, I'm just going to put this in frame, you can sell a Stanley
Yeah.
Cup very quickly and massively. And shouts to, I believe it was the CEO of Crocs who then went over there. Like the ability to market that and market that effectively. The other part of that is that there will always be someone else. There will always be other options. And not only will there be other consumer options, but there will be global consumer options, right? There will be other things that will be available on Temu. There'll be other things that will be available everywhere else. So I guess I don't want to stress out marketers, but I would just close it with this. You have the ability to almost go marketing viral very quickly and extract a lot of money on a campaign, and then you're going to have to figure out a way to completely reinvent that 3 months later.
I think we completely agree with you.
No,
So, I think very rightly put, right? And I think only addition I would make to it is that as a marketer, it would be very helpful for you to identify the subcultures
yeah,
which your
Yes.
brand could relate back into, right? So where
Mm-hmm.
will you get that fierce loyalty from, right? There has to be a reason for that fierce loyalty, right? There was a point in certain different generations where a TV or a newspaper or an outdoor was the point of communication and point of conviction, and then came the brand endorsements from large actors or local leaders. When that endorsement happened, that kind of was a point of conviction, right? Today, that point of conviction has shifted to what we say, to a certain community leaders, and these could be content creators who are a certain community leaders, right? Example Stanley, when you spoke about,
Yep.
right? If Stanley would have gone into, let's say, uh, a pro skater subcultures or graffiti subcultures and came in from there, it could have induced a fierce loyalty there, and then it could have seen a trickle effect across certain different subcultures, right? And there will always be a fear that a new competitor is going to come in, that new competitor is going to take over that share. So, as you rightly put, there has to be burst campaigns which are culturally relevant. They tap into a certain community. You create that community. You again reinvent either for the same community or for the next community. So, it's going to be a very ongoing cycle that the brands will have to look when it goes across into the future.
I would like to add over here. So while of course we've been speaking about a lot of new ways in which marketeers may get stressed out, I think the next point which I'll tell would help marketeers ease in a bit. I feel while of course there are 100 new challenges, 100 new opportunities which Gen Zs bring to the table, I think there is one very important common point which stays true, right? Which the common point is also called stay true, right?
Yeah.
Stay true to your brand, stay honest, right? Honesty is a pursuit which Gen Z values beyond most other things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which is a common pursuit which also a Gen X had, is a common pursuit which also a Gen Y had, right?
Yeah.
So I think that could be one of the lowest hanging fruits for a lot of marketers, where I think that this would be one of the first skill set, or first core quality of marketing which a marketer can kind of amplify, right?
Well, it's
So
yeah. It's like Gen Z, and to a different extent, right? Every generation doesn't necessarily want to feel like they're being marketed to. Like, and you were talking about that, they can spot things out, right? You go all the way back to the infomercial. The infomercial was successful for a small time. People then
True.
figured it out. The banner ad was effective until it wasn't. All of these methods are effective until they're not, right? And so, what is being done with Gen Z? It's just that life cycle. It's just that half life is faster. What I'm thinking about with Gen Z when it comes to purchasing behavior too is that you have to, how do I want to put this? You have to be flexible as a marketer because, and not to overuse the Stanley example, but there's plenty of these things. We often in this field talk about user generated content, right? When we were trying to
Sure.
build out social 15 years ago, it's all about, well, you want to have fiercely loyal fans, and you understand that 95% of people on social are probably just listening. 5% are the ones that are really your content creators. And so we talk about user generated content. I want to start talking about user generated marketing. Obviously, that Stanley example started with people who weren't affiliated with the brand, just liked it, thought it was interesting, and wanted to go out and sell it. And so it's so tough as a marketer because you want to be true to your brand. You let's get behind the scenes for a second. You're doing planning, you're doing forecasting, you're doing research, you're putting together. You might have put together a 4-month long campaign behind the
Sure.
scenes, which, by the way, that sounds stressful. Please don't do that. I'd rather just do small things, A/B test them, and see what works the best, and then drive with that. But you can understand if you're a rigid organization, it's very hard to market to Gen Z because I want to be open to user generated marketing. I want to, if someone or some group or some influential people on Instagram come to me and say, you know what, we really like your product. You haven't been marketing to us, but we like it and we would like to do something with it. And I think the most flexible brands will be the most efficient when they say, worth a shot, go
Yeah.
for it.
I think Jeff so rightly spotted, because that's a very true change that we are observing with some of our clients. All right. Obviously, not 100% shift because it's not
Yeah.
possible and it's not very wise to kind of throw away ages of wisdom. But now we have brands that have set about good 20 to 30% of their budgets on things that they know is gonna come ad hoc, on
Yeah.
things that are either gonna get into catching on to the trends
yeah,
or spotting subcultures and getting into it. Like, we have brands that have now turned towards anime,
anime.
sneaker cultures, e-gaming,
Mm-hmm.
esports completely a
Yeah,
part of
Yeah.
their budgets, right? Saying that, hey, we need to explore what else, like, let us throw it onto the wall and see what's going to stick, because we have certain relevance. It's not coming out of a no research zone, not just a spray and pray, but we've done some part of our research. We know that there is a thread that connects us to this subculture. We know we can create something new for this subculture. And here are the opinion leaders, KOLs in this subculture. Now, how could we link together and, kind of look at ad hoc things that are coming along in this space, right? And then there is a part of the budget which is purely dedicated only to catch on to the trends, right? So I'll give you an example. Out here in the country, we work with, we're working Coca-Cola and the group essentially, where we were able to spot a group of creators called the Quickstyle, all right, which is a Norwegian dance crew. All right. So they're a Norwegian dance crew. They kind of did a performance on a Hindi song, which was very socially, culturally,
Song, yeah.
a Bollywood song, very socially, culturally relevant to India as a country. They became kind of a big thing. We were able to spot that. We were in discussions with them. They came down to the country. Uh, we approached Indian brands or the brands in India, including Coca-Cola and others, and we kind of showcased that there is a relevance for a Norwegian dance crew because they have a lot of uptake or viewership from this country.
Norwegian Gen Z dance crew.
Yeah, Norwegian Gen Z dance crew. Absolutely right. And then we could go on to kind of do some really big things with the brand and the dance crew and some of the other global brands, right? So that is something that could only happen because those brands were flexible. They had a part of their budget and thought process reserved for something that they knew that, hey, if an opportunity like this comes, then we should be able to kind of pick it up. So I think you pretty rightly put in terms of the way you had, dissected it.
We're not going to name the title of this episode "How to Leverage a Norwegian Gen Z Dance Group," but it would be one of our best titles. But that's the thing; something can come from anywhere, and so I think the biggest change in functionality, right? And we're having a conversation about Gen Z, and so this will apply. I think the biggest change for marketers is that it used to be monoculture. We used to have less sources of information, so you could have the celebrity endorser, or you could have the thing that everybody could point to and go, yeah, that's, we the brand, we the agency are dictating that content to you. Correct. And the functionality now is it's social listening, it's targeting to make sure that we figure out how we can reach you best. Not it's less messaging and it's more timing, right? So it's targeting, it's timing, and then it's being able to be flexible. All of these things, it's so funny. If you got into this field 20 years ago, unfortunately I did, you would have been taught, and I just remember like textbooks from 2003 that were like, okay, well, this is how you have to do this. And then I'm like, yeah, you should just rip them up and probably take them to a Goodwill, because things have evolved. And what I've noticed the most, it's the marketers who are like, yeah, fine, whatever I've known, whatever SWOT analysis I've done in the past, blow it up, because this is where we are. And it's very undeniable, right? As even if you think of marketing as this precious creative pursuit where you're trying to always out clever the other brand, it doesn't matter as much if you don't have the data and the specifics and the listening tools behind it.
Correct. So I think see, fundamentally, one only has 24 hours a day, right? That has not changed. Yeah. The supply of time hasn't changed, right? But access and quantum of content has scaled up, right? It has scaled up tremendously over the last few years. Now think of it, right? At a very macro level, there is too much of supply and there is stagnant or constant time available, right? So in the same time, you would want to see more, right? So in the same time, if you want to see more, you would want to consume faster, right? If you want to consume faster, that means you want to see shorter content, right?
Yeah.
So technically, that that's fundamentally the reason why shorter content is a lot more common these days. Talk to a marketer 20 years back and tell him that your story would be told in 10 seconds or 6 seconds. He would have laughed, right? But now I think it's a new normal.
I,
You know,
I
you're playing right into the name of the organization, and I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
no, I think what you said is so important that 20 years back, I mean, and this is not from the brands, right? This is from a very agency
Mhm.
narrative or a business narrative, is that at some point of time, the ask from us was different. However, the basic truth was always that you have to be on culture,
Yeah.
understand what is culturally relevant, right? And then dig insights and come up with something that kind of strikes the balance with people, right? That they find it worth their attention. That is still the basic law. The only thing, but that has changed dramatically uh, today. If we go on to see, is that size of access of culture has changed so much, right? As an agency, suddenly our job is to become to be on top of the trends, on top of the culture, understanding what are the subcultures, understanding what are the changes, understanding which creators is on the high, uh,
Yeah.
suddenly which subgroup is talking about which creator, what trend. It has just gone all over the place, right? As an agency now, our job is just to keep a tap on the culture
Yeah.
left, right, and center. I'll give you an example, right? Think about a brand creating a brilliant brand film and getting X
Hmm.
number of views, and then think about a brand that tapped onto the Wes Anderson trend very early and created a good content and the kind of views that it would have got. Those are two different things, right? But then, was it possible had the agency or the internal brand marketing team not spotted it and would be able to convince the right kind of relevant people that, hey guys, we need to create this content and do it? So the role of agency has completely shifted in terms of the creative process, right? The agency is now also supposed to be someone who is very well informed on where the culture is heading and who are
Yeah.
the opinion leaders in different cultures or subcultures essentially, and then where could the next trend be coming from. I think that is
Oh,
a
yeah.
significant change.
And that changes so frequently. It's an inverse conversation what I have on here a lot because I'll talk to creators. I'll talk to them about, I mean, the stress, the anxiety, the dopamine rush of you have to keep creating because you have to stay relevant.
True.
But thinking about it from the agency standpoint, you're also constantly having to assess and reassess. Like, is this the right person? I'm a big proponent of not working with just one creator and diversifying that experience, not only for diversification of voice and representation, but also because these things change, right? Whims change, so you have to be nimble and flexible with creators. But the other thing too is that culture is different for everyone. I wrote a piece on LinkedIn this week where I was talking about, again, and I mentioned it, the death of monoculture. Culture can mean you could throw the same thing at 10 people right now and you might get 8 different answers on culture just because their algorithm is different. You and I do not see the same internet. No two
Correct.
people see the same internet.
True.
Therefore, and it's wonderful, right? I just alluded 5 minutes ago that it is wonderful as a marketer that I can know your preferences and I can tailor something specifically to you that is going to create a much greater opportunity for success. But what it also does is it means that it's so hard to market in mass to large
Absolutely.
swaths of people.
So it is very truly said, and I think a good observation. It's one of those observations that has kept Shrenik and me awake at night
Yeah.
sometimes, right?
Yeah, same.
Because that's when we end up scrolling our feeds quite a lot, and then that realization that you're not seeing what I'm seeing, right? And it's like a rabbit hole. Each
Hmm.
person across the world has their own rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Once you
Oh
open
yeah.
up your platforms, you're down that rabbit hole, and we all have a very different perspective to it, right? But what I'll tell you, what we've done is we've kind of tried to evolve a smaller framework, All right. So what we call it is a marketing mix for Gen Z on our end. All right.
Mm.
So what we did is, like, as millennials, we grew up where there are four P's or seven P's of marketing, and that was our textbook understanding product price, promotion, place, blah blah blah. And
Oh
then we
yeah,
would kind of go down that, right?
all the
We kind
P's.
of
Yep.
pivoted. Yeah, I mean, we all read that, right? And so we went across and we kind of put a simple pivots across, right? We came up back with what's the culture, right? Explore the dynamic world of subcultures, create authentic stories, all right, out of it essentially. That makes you part of your consumer lives in the most organic way possible. All right. So you don't go on to create something which is not part of their life. How is it that you could be part of their life? So try to understand that culture, right? When
Hmm.
it comes to platforms, don't limit yourself to seeing conventional lenses to the platforms and
Yep.
segmenting them as social and digital, but also look at as new age spaces. So what are the digital campfires that you can create? How could you be part of it, right? Uh, you've known about Reddit, you've known about Discord, you've known about Twitch. So how are you but kind of creating your digital campfires in these kind of platforms? So how do you bring that as a part of your conventional marketing mix essentially, right? You look at influence, then finally associate with the faces. Now these could be creators, ambassadors, celebrities, consumers for that matter, right? That don't just serve as a promotional medium but become as carriers of the brand's essence and philosophy. That is very very important, right? There was a time when ambassador's job was just to deliver a message and not be
Hmm.
part of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
That doesn't work anymore, right?
Yeah.
And then you finally come across to the communities where you're creating your own brand tribes, which has never been more essential. It was always there. It was a very powerful tool. Now it's a necessary tool. You can't do without it anymore. You spoke about Stanley.
Hmm.
Whether they did it or whether it organically happened for a while, but the brand tribe got
Yeah.
created, and that's what kind of propelled them into the space where they are. Wherever you are sitting and wherever I am sitting, we both know the brand,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And Stanley might not even be available in my country, but
Yeah.
I'm very well aware about Stanley, right? So having that community, so giving people a clear understanding of the social, emotional, functional
Yeah.
value that you promise, right, is crucial to building that loyalty if there is any,
Yeah.
at least a brand love for the dynamic cohort that Gen Zs are. So I think that's how we are kind of doing and changing things a little on our own end to evolve across to the current trend.
Yeah. And I think two things which Mitesh mentioned, I'll just scale that up as well. Platforms and influence, right?
Hmm.
You know, if marketeers are still, hell-bent on thinking of the two, three platforms which they have been thinking about for the last few years, and if they don't start exploring the new digital campfires, which are actually always there, but now they've suddenly become a lot more populated, right?
Yeah.
I think they are living in an echo chamber, right? They need to go out, explore these new platforms, because that's where a lot of conversations are happening. That in all probability could be a gold mine of insights, right? You may realize a lot more things about your brand, about your competition by just being present on those platforms, right? So
Oh yeah.
that's point one. Point two is influence, right? Gone are the days where a classic celebrity would service a message as effectively as a new age influencer would,
Yeah.
right? Because I think people connect a lot more with the influencers. A celebrity could be an influencer, right?
Sure.
Having said that, there are a lot of new age influencers on new age platforms which are very viral, which are very relevant more than viral, right? So I think those are the things marketeers should put in a lot more emphasis on.
No, I think you're making good points on platform because the other thing to it too is, if somebody, I guess if there's a lack of traffic on certain ones, right? Yes, there is obviously beyond Insta, beyond TikTok, all that. But if there's a lack of content on Snapchat and you can stand out, consider it. Same thing with LinkedIn, right? But the other thing that we're talking about is Reddit. Reddit and Discord, but especially Reddit, because it does not matter the brand. You want to get honest feedback about yourself, don't go to Google reviews, go to Reddit. You will find everything you need to know about your brand. All your market research is sitting on Reddit right now because everybody will share direct and honest feedback on Reddit. It's insanely helpful, and it's insanely helpful to kind of figure out from there, who are, because sometimes the people who are complaining about your brand the most are also the ones that care the most about your brand, and then that can be something you can leverage. The other thing is, as a marketer, I never want to fall victim to the mistake of trying to duplicate something. And
Do what?
because
Sorry?
to duplicate something. So,
Yeah.
when, like 10 years ago, when somebody was like, hey, I'd walk into a meeting and somebody would be like, well, what's our ice bucket challenge? And I'm like, none. You are not doing something like that. That is not, some things cannot be duplicated, but I think one thing can be duplicated. If I go back to this, and I don't want to overuse the Stanley example, but I invoked it, so now I have to see this to
We
fruition.
continue with it.
What I think is going to be interesting is, it's much like in the U.S. where people have bought stocks of companies that may not be doing well, and they've
Correct.
tried to kind of elevate the stock, whether it's GameStop,
Absolutely.
AMC, all that. I think there's a value in legacy brands. Like Stanley's been around since 1913. There is a value in slightly dormant legacy brands that have insanely good infrastructure and insanely good distribution that influencers can work with, because it's tough to take something that people don't know, or it's tough to take a new company that doesn't have the logistics to scale. But if you have a company that's been around, it's not for the Gen Z market yet. That to me is a formula that I think can be duplicated. Just not another large, what's this, like 48 ounce? This is too much water, guys. I'm so sorry. But like that, to me, I think there are ways in which you can take influence, pair it with legacy brands with good logistics, and create something. I think that's an interesting new possible marketing case study that I wasn't even thinking about 6 months ago.
I think everyone loves cool grandparents.
Yeah.
I think that is what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Right?
You remember the stories like a couple years ago where everybody was dressing up in grandparent chic. They're like, and then you're like, is that? Then you have to, as a marketer, you have to have this honest conversation with yourself. You're like, is that a trend that's going to stick around? Do I have, like, which ones do I have to care about? I'm on TikTok live saying ice cream tastes so good. Like, what am I doing with my life? Yeah, that's real. That, I guess, when we close these interviews, I like to do something called keep it short. It's 3 questions. The questions are short. Your answers can be however long you would like. Are you ready?
Yeah, let's go for it.
All right. Question 1. How do you determine when something is a trend and when something has staying power?
All right. So in our case, Jeff, we kind of go back and rely a lot onto the data. So we are kind of tracking creators. We are tracking a lot of meme pages. We are tracking a lot of comments and pieces that are being spoken around it. And we kind of take data straight away and give a qualitative scoring across to the things, right? First thing first, nobody can predict it. That's the basic rule that you live with, right?
Yeah.
In life, nobody could. In fact, you spoke about Reddit. Reddit is crazy loaded with information, right? But it helps you to understand that there is always a law. All right. The law is that the conversation starts somewhere on the internet, and it doesn't matter that conversation is fresh or it is 3 years old. First of all, everybody needs to learn that anything can come back in vogue and fashion at any given point of time. All right. Then you understand that where is it born, right? The Reddit, 4chan used to be at some point of time. There are different places which you need to know. So you need to know where is it born. You need to see who's picking up and who started speaking about it. Which creators finally spoke about it, but what is the kind of influence score that the creator also holds, right? The cloud score that they technically have, right? And then where is the pickup happening? So you could only see that trend and make a forecast that maybe this is going to be long living, or you could say, hey, maybe this is not even going to cross the chasm and it's not going to come into the main culture. It's just gonna remain its own subculture, and it's not gonna come out of it. So that's an active call that we make, and sometimes it's just also pure common sense, where you feel something is too stupid to go too big, but then internet kind of surprises you
Yeah,
every now and then. So
yeah,
yeah, you can't help that.
yeah. Dogecoins to the moon.
It always does. It's one of those things where I think you have to have long term narrative as a brand, but I think long term planning is kind of a fool's errand because it's going to change.
It's
So
changing
if
too
you're
fast.
trying, yeah, if you're trying to make an 18-month plan
Yeah,
on execution, no. If you're trying to make an 18-month plan on the narrative and what your brand is trying to convey, yeah, yeah,
yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
absolutely.
yeah.
Question two: what are, if any, and I'm assuming there are, the specific nuances of Gen Z in India?
In India,
Yeah,
interesting. I interesting question. I think the Gen Z in India is much more evolved than Gen X and Gen Y of India, right? Again, I think power of information. They have a lot more access to information. One very interesting nuance which I was reading was while they aspire to be, global citizens in terms of
mm-hmm.
global digital citizens, one very
Yeah,
interesting thing, interesting trend which we saw was they are well rooted to the Indian culture, right? So think of it, they
yeah.
they're seeing the world at a very top level, yet grounded with the Indian cultural nuances. So that is a very unique trait which we've seen in the Indian Gen Zs.
I
Yeah,
think
it's
if you
interesting.
also look at it, how we've seen the changes out here, um, it's a little in sync with the global, but not that kind of a sync. Is Indian Gen Zs have finally given an opportunity to independents or indie brands in India
Yeah,
in a different space altogether. There was a time that we grew believing that, hey, this is a German made or a
yeah,
Japanese made or an American made product, and it brings a certain kind of a superiority versus my local consumption potential,
Yeah,
right? That
yeah,
trend has turned on its head completely, which is something very interesting for us to
yeah,
observe out here. I think new indie brands and Indian brands have got an opportunity that was never present in the past, right? So I think there's a need to be global yet very rooted into your own culture. There is a
yeah,
point of pride in the current country made products and the tech that is coming out of India, right? There's also pride in a lot of Indian creators and how the world sees the country. I think those are big cultural seismic shifts that we are observing that kind of differentiates how the Gen Zs are behaving in India versus what we kind of do on an observation level with the other countries right
yeah.
well, I think that's those two are related, right? Those two things, if you're tapped into your culture and then you're respecting more the products
now. Yes,
made in your
Absolutely.
country,
I think
that
I think it's
makes
a
sense.
subset, right? It's a very logical action point of respecting culture. When you respect the culture and when you're deep rooted in the culture, you would essentially end up buying or consuming from the culture, right? So I think that's happening a lot more now.
Okay, so question three, and this one is actually, normally these questions are short. I'll try and make this short. I typically ask, I typically ask very forward thinking questions, like 5 years, 10 years. But let me ask it differently. How far forward are you, or should you be looking when you're thinking about trends, AI, opportunities? What is your typical timeline of forecasting?
So like you mentioned sometime back, the brand narrative could be say 1,000-day vision,
Yeah.
right? But I strongly believe the brand should have a 365-day vision in hand and keep relooking at it every 100 days, right? So
Yeah.
essentially every 3 months, every end of quarter, you should
Hmm.
relook at your vision while have like a midterm annual vision while have a larger 5-year narrative.
I
No,
think
I like that. Yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, I think It's a very strong question, Jeff, right? While you summarized it into lesser alphabets, right? I believe this is a very difficult time to kind of take a long-term view,
Yeah,
especially with AI, as Shrenik
correct.
and I were discussing other day, right? If there was a thing you thought AI does not do perfectly well 3 months back,
Hmm.
I promise you, please go and revisit it today and revisit it again in next 3 months and
Mm.
again in 3 months, right?
Yeah,
Hmm.
The There is a compounding growth. It's not a linear growth. It's a compounding growth that AI is going through. So the way when AI goes through in that kind of a stance,
yeah,
right? Uh, it is not a very long term view that you can take on how things will happen. As we rightly across this podcast, as we spoke about, from an internal culture narrative, as a brand narrative and purpose narrative, you could stand for certain things and that could be a very long term thing. But how the world changes, how the technology is changing, how the access to the people is changing,
yeah.
I think it's extremely difficult to even, like, could you three, between three of us, can we
Hmm.
actually predict what more will OpenAI launch in 2024? We can't.
No.
OpenAI just launched their video platform and the world is going berserk over it.
I
Right?
know. I was gonna mention that because that part is fascinating to me, right? When you look at and you're talking about the half-life of AI is just insane, right? I often joke that right now AI doesn't do opinions well. It kind of just straddles the line. It'll answer
Correct.
a question and be like, well, it could do this, it could do this. And when it starts doing that, oh, okay. Like when it's doing video, that's interesting, fascinating. Time savers, right now it's time savers, but when it starts to
Correct.
get a little bit more, and you're
Smarter.
alluding to this, yeah, when it gets smarter and when it starts making the critical decisions, this can get very interesting. But I think to summarize, oh, go ahead.
In fact, I have a very interesting analogy. They since we're talking AI and since we have been talking Gen Z, right?
Mhm.
The way you communicate with AI, right, versus the way you communicate with a Gen Z are completely opposite. Let me give you three examples.
Love
When
it.
you talk to an artificial intelligence tool, you have to dump it down. You have to put in as many keywords as possible to get the right kind of information. When
Gotta
you're
do the right
talking to
prompt
a Gen
manager, yeah.
Z, you have to smart it up. You cannot,
Mhm.
you have to you have to tell what actually matters. You have to you have to hold the conversation smart enough. Second
Mhm.
differentiation: if you are talking to AI, you have to be as long as possible in your keywords and in your brief. When you're talking to a Gen Z, you have to keep it as short as possible, right? And third, when you're talking to AI, you can't use jargons, right? You have to break
Mhm.
down your jargons. And when you're talking to a Gen Z, there's a whole new bloody Gen Z lingo, Gen Z dictionary. You have to speak their language. You can't be in Delulu.
Uh,
I've also learned that if I start speaking that language, it has now stopped being cool. I've immediately burned whatever term that is, and then it can't be used. Like, oh well, cross that one off the list. But you're right. And so here's the wonderful challenge. Here's the wonderful, beautiful challenge you've laid out. If you're talking to Gen Z, just I mean, this seems simple, right? Just make it really smart, really short, and use a lot of jargon that you don't know. That's easy, right? But the way I wanted to wrap up this entire conversation was that you can plan for things, you can look for things, you can definitely understand culture, algorithms, everything that goes into marketing to Gen Z. You can make a plan, and then at some point, that plan just has to shift to a Norwegian dance
True.
group.
That I think that has worked very well for our clients, Jeff. So that's a great advice.
Thank you so much for joining.
Right. Thank
Yeah,
you so much for
thank you. It
having
was
us,
a
Jeff.
great conversation.
All right.